Module 10, the endocrine system, endocrine glands and hormones. In this section, I will begin to describe individual glands of the endocrine system, including some of the hormones they produce. The hypothalamus is located just below the brain. We've already talked a bit about this gland when going over the central nervous system. This is because the hypothalamus is considered to be a part of the central nervous system. See again how these two organ systems overlap a bit? Well, the hypothalamus is also an endocrine gland. It will respond to various stimuli and can secrete hormones to regulate the pituitary gland located just below it. So the hormones that the hypothalamus secretes affect another endocrine gland. That makes them special hormones. Actually, the hypothalamus secretes two categories of hormones: hormones that cause the pituitary gland to secrete more hormones, or releasing hormones, and hormones that cause the pituitary gland to secrete fewer hormones, or inhibiting hormones. Now let's talk about the pituitary gland. It is a comparatively smaller gland, and it's composed of two tinier glands called the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. These two parts of the pituitary gland are different in their structure as well as what they do. The anterior pituitary gland produces many major hormones in the body. Growth hormone does just what its name suggests. It stimulates growth in most body tissues. And one of the key tissues affected by growth hormone is bone tissue. Therefore, growth hormone makes our bones grow. It is produced in much higher amounts when we are young. Therefore, growth hormone levels are usually higher in children than in adults. Well, why is it made at all when we are adults if we have stopped growing? Well, it continues to maintain bone density by stimulating our bone cells to reproduce as old bone cells are broken down. And it has other jobs besides growth. It helps to regulate metabolism. Thyroid stimulating hormone is responsible for increasing the secretion of another hormone called thyroxine from the thyroid. So it's a hormone released by an endocrine gland to stimulate the release of another hormone released by another endocrine gland. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is released in greater amounts when we experience excess emotional or physical stress. This hormone will then increase the stress hormone called cortisol, which the adrenal glands secrete. Luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone both stimulate the ovaries or testes, organs that are part of the reproductive system. Prolactin is a hormone that stimulates milk production in females, but it also has other responsibilities, so it is found in both males and females. And finally, melanocyte-stimulating hormone increases melanin production by the melanocytes. So you can see that many of these hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary gland work to stimulate hormone release in other endocrine glands. These types of hormones are called tropic hormones, and this is why the pituitary is often called the master endocrine gland. It kind of behaves as a master gland over the other glands. Yet there's another master that controls the pituitary. Remember that the hypothalamus regulates the pituitary gland. One hormone it releases is growth hormone releasing hormone. Can you guess what this hormone encourages the pituitary gland to do? Of course, it stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete growth hormone. The hypothalamus also secretes corticotropin-releasing hormone, which stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropic hormone. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone causes the anterior pituitary to increase its secretion of those hormones that control the gonads, or ovaries and testes. Those would be follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone causes the anterior pituitary to release thyroid-stimulating hormone. And there's one more produced by the hypothalamus, but it has an inhibitory effect. It produces an inhibitory hormone called prolactin inhibiting hormone. That reduces the amount of prolactin secreted by the anterior pituitary. So though the pituitary is called the master endocrine gland, the hypothalamus is the master of the master. Now let's look at the posterior pituitary gland. It secretes two main hormones. The first is antidiuretic hormone, which is also known as vasopressin. It increases how much water is retained by the kidneys. This would reduce urine production. The second is oxytocin, which increases the contractions of the uterus during birth. It also stimulates the release of breast milk when a baby is nursing. And the hypothalamus is also a master of this gland too. It contains neurons that synthesize antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Then these hormones move down the axons of the neurons until they reach the posterior pituitary gland. So technically, we call these two hormones neurohormones because they were synthesized by neurons and released by an endocrine gland. The next gland is the thyroid gland. It's located at the base of the neck and is butterfly or bow tie shaped. The thyroid secretes two major hormones. Thyroxine is for increase of the metabolic rate of most of the body's cells. It controls how the cells utilize oxygen. If too much thyroxine is released in the body, metabolic rate increases too much. Weight loss occurs because excess caloric energy is being used up, and one can experience anxiety. Too little thyroxine causes fatigue, weight gain, and a slower mental activity. The second major hormone secreted by the thyroid is calcitonin. It is a limited hormone that targets osteoclasts in the bone. Remember that osteoclasts break down bone tissue. Calcitonin inhibits osteoclast activity so that calcium levels in the blood decrease. This is because when less bone is broken down, less calcium is released into the blood. The next glands I'm going to talk about are a group of 4 small ones located in the 4 wings of the thyroid gland. These are the parathyroid glands, and they secrete parathyroid hormone. This hormone behaves oppositely to calcitonin by stimulating osteoclast activity and raising blood calcium levels. Parathyroid hormone also stimulates the intestines to take in more calcium, as well as the kidneys to do the same. That will then raise the blood calcium level. Now, this is a life-essential effect. If we didn't have parathyroid hormone, calcium levels in our blood would decrease. Remember, we need calcium in our body to affect action potentials on our nerves. With low calcium levels, excess action potentials would result, overstimulating the skeletal and cardiac muscles. The next glands are the adrenal glands. There is one adrenal gland located near the top of each of your 2 kidneys. At the core of each gland is the adrenal medulla, which is surrounded by the adrenal cortex. The adrenal medulla is responsible for producing epinephrine and norepinephrine. I already discussed these hormones when I talked about the fight or flight response of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. The adrenal cortex also produces hormones. In fact, it produces many, up to 50. One is cortisol. Cortisol is secreted by the adrenal cortex when the body experiences stress. Its major job is to increase the breakdown of protein and fat in tissue. This is because during stressful times, you need to have a good supply of glucose for your brain. And when tissues break down fats and proteins, cortisol saves the glucose so that the brain can use it. Another adrenal cortex hormone is aldosterone. It causes the kidneys to retain sodium. This then causes water to fill the kidneys via osmosis. This happens when the body becomes low in salt concentrations. The next part of the endocrine system is the pancreas. It is actually part of both the endocrine system and the digestive system. For the endocrine system, the pancreas produces insulin and glucagon. Both of these hormones are made within cells called pancreatic islets, or islets of Langerhans. Specific cells in these islets, called beta cells, are the ones that secrete the insulin. Insulin is responsible for stimulating most of the body's cells to pull in glucose. This will then reduce the levels of glucose in the blood. Other cells on the islets are called alpha cells, and they secrete glucagon, which creates an opposite effect. It causes the liver to release glucose, and that will increase blood glucose levels. So, under normal conditions, insulin causes cells of the body to take in glucose, which comes from the digestive system to the blood system. If the pancreas doesn't work properly, it can result in a condition called diabetes mellitus. And there are 2 types of diabetes. Type 1 diabetes mellitus, or insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, occurs when the pancreas cannot produce insulin. Well, if there's no insulin, body cells will not take in glucose, and blood glucose levels become high. Because there's little to no glucose in the cells, people with type 1 diabetes become weak because their cells have to utilize the energy in proteins and fat instead of glucose. Thus, they slowly lose weight because they're breaking down their body fat. Thankfully, people with this condition can treat it by taking regular injections of insulin. Type 2 diabetes mellitus, or non-insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, is caused by the cells of the body being unable to respond to insulin in an efficient manner because there are not many insulin receptors on the cells. Thus, they still don't take in glucose. This is a more common form of diabetes and easier to treat with diet and exercise, and sometimes taking medications. You are likely familiar with this condition, often referred to as diabetes. But there's a different type of diabetes called diabetes insipidus, which has nothing to do with pancreatic function, but rather has to do with low production of antidiuretic hormone production by the posterior pituitary gland. Now, there are endocrine glands in the reproductive system as well. In females, the ovaries produce the hormones estrogen and progesterone. In males, the testes produce testosterone. I'll talk more about these hormones in the module on reproduction, but they are responsible for causing physical changes during puberty, as well as playing a part in reproduction. The next gland is the pineal body. This gland is located in the brain, so it's not exposed to light, but it's affected by nerve signals coming from the eyes. You see, when light enters the eyes, the pineal body produces serotonin. When the eyes aren't exposed to light, the pineal body stops making serotonin and begins making melatonin. Well, this light and dark stimulation and the resulting hormones released by it help to affect our day and night cycles as well as reproductive readiness. A good example of how this works is by looking at the reproductive cycles of some animals. For animals such as sheep, their reproductive readiness is dependent on the relative length of day and night. So in the fall and early winter, daylight hours decrease and nighttime hours increase. There's less light stimulating the pineal body. This means they will be ready to reproduce, and the females go into estrus, or into heat. This is directly due to the pineal bodies reacting to shorter days and longer nights. Now, birds react to these changes oppositely. They become ready to reproduce when the daylight hours increase and the nighttime hours decrease. So this happens in the spring and early summer. Why are these animals different from each other? It's actually very interesting. You see, in both cases, the offspring are born in the spring or early summer. This is because mammals such as sheep have a longer duration of pregnancy, so they need to reproduce earlier in the year, so the young are born in the spring. But it takes a shorter time for the offspring of birds to develop and hatch. So though their pineal glands react differently to the daylight hours, they produce the same final results. Well, in humans, the pineal body releases melatonin, causing the hypothalamus to release gonadotropin-releasing hormone. And that's about all we know. We aren't really sure what happens next, but we do know that if young girls aren't exposed to much light, such as those living closer to the North Pole areas, they reach puberty sooner than other girls. This points to the pineal body light connection. Additionally, if the pineal body is damaged, puberty occurs more rapidly too. So we can say that the pineal body is somehow connected to human reproduction. We know of another area that the pineal body affects. It's our sleep cycle. When the eyes are not detecting light, the pineal body produces melatonin. So at night, your eyes aren't receiving light. You make melatonin, and you become sleepy. This is why we sleep better if the lights are turned off, because our levels of melatonin rise. And you can't just close your eyelids. That's not good enough, because light rays can still penetrate to your eyes and thus prevent melatonin production. Interestingly, caffeine decreases melatonin, yet another reason why we're kept awake if we have too much caffeine at night. Melatonin levels in the body tend to be much higher in children and then become lesser and lesser as you age. That's why babies seem to be able to sleep anywhere at any time. Yet as you age, it gets more and more difficult to sleep. Good night. I have plenty of melatonin. The final endocrine gland to discuss is the thymus. It is responsible for the production of thymosin that helps the immune system develop. Well, in this section, I have gone over all the classic endocrine glands, yet there are other body organs that can produce hormones. The stomach and small intestine can make hormones, for example, to help control digestion. The heart produces atrial natriuretic hormone that causes the kidneys to release salt and water. Even your fat tissue makes the hormone leptin that is responsible to signal the hypothalamus that you are full and should stop eating. The more and more we learn about the human body, the more hormones we are discovering. So you just need to know that we will only be covering the major hormones from the classic endocrine glands, yet there are many, many more.